The morning of November 15th, 1943, on Tarawa Atoll, through the acrid smoke of naval bombardment, Japanese Colonel Keiji Shibasaki watched American landing craft approach the reef. From his reinforced bunker, he had a clear view of what was coming. Amphibious vehicles, infantry, and behind them, on the beach, the first American tanks were rolling ashore. Medium tanks, the M4 Sherman. Shibasaki had studied intelligence reports on these machines. 30 tons, 75mm gun, gasoline engine. Adequate, perhaps, but nothing that Japanese anti-tank doctrine couldn't handle. What he didn't know, what no Japanese commander yet understood, was that these tanks possessed a technological advantage so subtle, so seemingly insignificant, that it would fundamentally change how armor fought in the Pacific. The M4 Sherman was equipped with a gyroscopic stabilizer for its main gun, and Japanese forces were about to learn what that meant in the most brutal way possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand how Japanese forces expected tank warfare to unfold. Their doctrine, developed through years of fighting in China and studied combat in Europe, assumed certain fundamental truths about how armored vehicles operated. Tanks, in the Japanese view, were mobile gun platforms. They moved to a position, stopped, aimed, fired. The stopping was crucial. You couldn't hit anything while moving, not with any accuracy. The gun would bounce, the sight picture would blur, the shell would go wild. So tanks advanced, stopped, fired, advanced again. This was how the Germans fought. This was how the Soviets fought. This was how the Japanese themselves fought with their own tanks. It was simply how armor warfare worked. Japanese anti-tank teams trained accordingly. Let the tank advance. Wait for it to stop. In that moment of stillness, when the turret traverses to aim, that's when you strike. Hit the tracks, hit the engine compartment, hit the thinner side armor. The tank's moment of greatest effectiveness, when it stopped to fire accurately, was also its moment of greatest vulnerability. This doctrine had worked in China against poorly coordinated Chinese armor. It seemed sound, but the Sherman changed everything, and the change came from a device most tankers barely thought about: the Westinghouse Gyro-Stabilizer. Installed in every M4 Sherman produced after early 1942, it was a complex mechanism of motors, gyroscopes, and hydraulics that did something revolutionary. It kept the gun pointed at the target even while the tank was moving over rough terrain. Not perfectly. The stabilizer couldn't compensate for every bump and lurch, but it could maintain the gun's elevation within a degree or two of the aim point, which meant a Sherman could fire while moving and actually hit what it was shooting at speeds up to 25 miles per hour. The American tankers who operated these machines understood the advantage intellectually. Their training manuals described the stabilizer's function. Their gunnery instructors emphasized its importance. But until they faced an enemy who expected them to stop before firing, they didn't fully appreciate what they possessed. The Japanese forces on Tarawa were about to provide that education. The Battle of Tarawa began with catastrophic miscalculation. The naval bombardment that was supposed to destroy Japanese defenses had barely scratched them. American Marines, wading ashore from landing craft, grounded on the reef, faced withering fire from concrete bunkers and reinforced positions, casualties mounted by the hundreds in the first hours. The Marines needed support. They needed the Shermans. The tanks came ashore through a nightmare of fire. Several were knocked out by Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns before they even reached dry ground. But others made it, and once they did, they began hunting Japanese positions with a methodology that stunned the defenders. The tanks didn't stop. They rolled forward continuously, turrets traversing, guns firing, and incredibly, impossibly, by Japanese understanding, they were hitting their targets. A Sherman would spot a pillbox, machine gun nest, or anti-tank position. The turret would swing toward the target, and while the tank was still moving, still bouncing over coral and debris, the gun would fire, and the shot would land. Not every time. The stabilizer wasn't magic, but enough times that Japanese positions that expected to have precious seconds to aim and fire found themselves under accurate fire before they could react. Corporal Tadashi Nakamura, manning a 47mm anti-tank gun in a reinforced position near the airfield, later described his experience to American interrogators. His team had destroyed a Sherman the previous day, using textbook tactics. Wait for the tank to stop, aim for the side armor, fire. It had worked perfectly. But on the second day, November 21st, he faced a different situation. A Sherman approached his position from roughly 200 yards. His crew, loaded armor-piercing ammunition, waited for the tank to stop to aim. It didn't stop. The tank kept rolling forward, turret traversing smoothly toward his position. Nakamura assumed the shot would be wild, poorly aimed. Then his position exploded. The 75mm shell had struck the gun shield dead center while the Sherman was still moving at what he estimated was 20 miles per hour. He was the only survivor. Similar accounts came from across the battlefield. Japanese anti-tank teams trained to exploit the moment when American tanks stopped to aim found that moment never came. The Shermans fired on the move, and they fired accurately enough to be deadly. At distances under 300 yards, the stabilizer gave Sherman gunners a real advantage. The Japanese hadn't expected this. They had no doctrine for countering it. Colonel Shibasaki died in his command bunker on the third day of fighting, killed by a flamethrower team supported by Sherman tanks that had systematically destroyed his defensive positions. Tarawa cost the Marines over 3,000 casualties, but it provided lessons, and one of those lessons was being recorded by Japanese survivors. American tanks could fire accurately while moving. This information needed to reach higher command. Through late 1943 and early 1944, reports filtered back to Tokyo from various Pacific battlefields. Makin, the Gilbert Islands, Ains Kwajalein. Everywhere American armor appeared, Japanese forces noted the same pattern. The tanks didn't stop to fire. They maintained continuous movement, making them harder to target while still delivering effective fire. Japanese intelligence officers compiled these reports with growing concern. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, assigned to command the defense of Iwo Jima in May 1944, studied every available intelligence report on American tactics. He was particularly interested in armor operations because Iwo Jima's volcanic soil would support tank movement. American armor would certainly be employed there, and he needed to understand how to counter it. The reports about American tanks firing while moving troubled him. How were they doing this? The reports offered no explanation, only observations of the effect. Kuribayashi requested technical intelligence on American armor. What he received was incomplete. Japanese intelligence had captured damaged Shermans, had even examined relatively intact vehicles, but they hadn't identified the stabilizer as significant. The mechanism wasn't obvious from external inspection. To someone unfamiliar with the concept, it looked like part of the gun's traverse and elevation system. Nothing special. The reports described the Sherman's armor thickness, its engine specifications, its armament. They noted the tank had good reliability and was produced in enormous quantities, but they missed the stabilizer. So Kuribayashi planned his defense based on what he knew. American tanks would attack. Japanese forces couldn't stop them in open combat. The Shermans were too numerous, too well supported by infantry and artillery. But in prepared positions, in terrain that channeled the tanks, Japanese anti-tank teams could destroy them. The key was forcing the tanks to slow down, to navigate obstacles, to present flank shots. At Iwo Jima, the terrain would help. The volcanic ash and rocky ground would slow American armor. Japanese guns, well positioned, could pick them off. What Kuribayashi couldn't plan for was fighting an enemy that could fire effectively at 25 miles per hour, while his guns needed the target stationary. February 19th, 1945. The first wave of Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima. Behind them, the Shermans landed, and almost immediately they faced the most sophisticated anti-tank defenses the Japanese had yet prepared. Kuribayashi had learned from earlier defeats. His guns weren't placed in obvious positions. They were hidden in caves, in bunkers, in reverse slope positions that couldn't be destroyed by pre-invasion bombardment. His anti-tank teams had orders to wait, to pick their shots carefully, hit the tanks from the flanks, from positions the tanks couldn't see until too late. The tactic worked. Initially, several Shermans were knocked out in the first days, but the American tankers adapted quickly. They learned to keep moving constantly, never presenting a stationary target. They learned to fire at suspected enemy positions while advancing, using the stabilizer to maintain accuracy while avoiding becoming an easy target themselves. They learned that a moving tank firing continuously was safer than a stopped tank trying to aim carefully. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions pushing inland from the beaches had Sherman companies attached. These tanks supported the infantry advance against Japanese positions that had been designed specifically to stop them, and they succeeded not because they were invulnerable, but because they could maintain fire superiority while mobile. A Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun in a prepared position might get one shot at a Sherman. If that shot missed or failed to penetrate, the Sherman would respond with high explosive or armor-piercing rounds while still moving, before the Japanese crew could reload. The stabilizer gave American crews precious seconds of advantage. In combat, seconds meant survival. Captain Tsuneo Wachi commanded a company of Japanese infantry with attached anti-tank guns defending positions near Hill 362. Over 5 days of combat, his anti-tank teams engaged American Shermans 18 times. They destroyed 3 tanks, damaged 2 others, but they lost all 6 anti-tank guns. The pattern was consistent. A gun would fire, would sometimes hit, but before the crew could reload or relocate, return fire would destroy the position. The American tanks, Wachi noted in a report that somehow survived the battle, fired while moving at speeds that should have made accurate fire impossible. Yet they hit their targets. How? The question reached Japanese command in Tokyo by March 1945. By then, Iwo Jima was lost. Over 20,000 Japanese soldiers had died defending it, including General Kuribayashi. The island had been captured at terrible cost to the Americans. Over 6,000 Marines killed. But captured it was, and American forces now had a detailed picture of Japanese defensive tactics. More importantly for this story, Japanese interrogators had captured American tankers, and from them, finally, they learned about the stabilizer. A Sherman commander, Lieutenant James Hawkins, 2nd Armored Battalion, 4th Marine Division, was captured when his tank threw a track while isolated from infantry support. Japanese forces overran the disabled tank, killing most of the crew, but capturing Hawkins and his gunner. During interrogation at a facility on the Japanese mainland, Hawkins was questioned extensively about American tank tactics. One question kept recurring. How do American tanks fire accurately while moving? Hawkins, perhaps not realizing the significance, explained the gyro-stabilizer. He described how it worked, how crews used it, how it allowed fire on the move. The Japanese interrogators were skeptical. Such a mechanism seemed impossible, or at least impossibly complex, for field use. But Hawkins insisted every Sherman had it. It was the standard equipment. American tankers trained extensively in firing while moving because the stabilizer made it effective. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The interrogation report reached the Imperial Japanese Army's Technical Intelligence Section in late March. Colonel Masao Yoshida, responsible for analyzing enemy equipment, read it with a growing sense of having missed something crucial. He ordered a review of all captured Sherman tanks in Japanese possession, find this stabilizer mechanism, understand how it works. By April 1945, Japanese technical intelligence had identified the Westinghouse gyro-stabilizer in captured Sherman tanks. They examined it, tested it where possible, and confirmed what Lieutenant Hawkins had described. The device stabilized the gun in elevation, allowing reasonably accurate fire while the tank was moving over rough terrain. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't compensate for all movement, but it gave American tankers a significant advantage in the kind of close-range combat that characterized Pacific Island fighting. Colonel Yoshida prepared a comprehensive report on the stabilizer for Imperial General Headquarters. The report detailed the mechanism's function, assessed its effectiveness, and analyzed its tactical implications. Those implications were devastating from a Japanese perspective. The entire basis of Japanese anti-tank doctrine assumed enemy tanks would stop to fire accurately. The Sherman's stabilizer invalidated that assumption. American tanks could maintain continuous movement, making them harder targets while still engaging Japanese positions effectively. The report reached senior Japanese commanders in late April. By then, the strategic situation was hopeless. Okinawa was under assault. The home islands faced imminent invasion. American strategic bombing was destroying Japanese cities. Learning about the Sherman's stabilizer now was like discovering the opponent's strategy in the final round of a fight you'd already lost. But the psychological impact was profound. For years, Japanese forces had been fighting an enemy whose equipment they thought they understood. Now they learned they'd missed a crucial technological advantage. What else had they missed? General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, received the briefing on the Sherman stabilizer in early May 1945. His response, recorded by his adjutant, was bitter. "So they've been able to fire while moving this entire time, and we've been training our anti-tank teams to wait for them to stop. No wonder we've been losing tanks faster than theirs." It wasn't just frustration at missing the technological detail, it was recognition that Japanese military intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood a key aspect of American tactical capability. The implications extended beyond tanks. If Japanese intelligence had missed something as significant as the Sherman stabilizer, what else had they missed? What other American technological advantages had Japanese forces been fighting blind against? The list was long. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that Japanese pilots didn't understand until they started dying in unprecedented numbers. Radar-directed naval gunfire that could hit targets in darkness and bad weather. The logistical capacity to sustain operations thousands of miles from American shores. The industrial capacity to produce everything from ammunition to aircraft carriers at scales Japanese planners had dismissed as propaganda. The stabilizer was a small thing in the grand scheme. It didn't win the war. American industrial might, strategic bombing, submarine warfare, and the atomic bombs decided Japan's fate. But the stabilizer symbolized a broader truth the Japanese command had refused to accept until far too late. America wasn't just bigger. It was more technologically sophisticated, more industrially capable, and more tactically flexible than Japanese doctrine had accommodated. The war ended before Japanese forces could adapt their anti-tank doctrine to account for the Sherman stabilizer. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The knowledge that American tanks could fire accurately while moving became a historical footnote, studied by military analysts after the war, but irrelevant to the outcome. But the story of the stabilizer revealed something important about how wars are fought and won. Technology matters, but understanding your opponent's technology matters more. Japanese forces fought the Sherman tank for nearly 3 years without recognizing one of its key advantages. They developed tactics based on incorrect assumptions. They trained anti-tank crews to exploit a vulnerability that didn't exist, and they paid for that misunderstanding with thousands of lives. After the war, military historians examined why Japanese intelligence failed to identify the Sherman stabilizer earlier. The answers were complex. Part of it was cultural. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spirit, determination, willpower. Technology was important, but secondary to fighting spirit. This philosophical bias meant Japanese intelligence focused more on assessing enemy morale and less on understanding enemy equipment in detail. Part of it was institutional. Japanese technical intelligence throughout the war was under-resourced and under-prioritized. Germany had extensive technical intelligence operations that captured and analyzed Allied equipment systematically. Japan did this less consistently. Captured Shermans were examined, but not with the thoroughness that would have revealed the stabilizer's significance, and part of it was simply the chaos of war. Intelligence reports from frontline units noted that American tanks fired while moving, but those reports competed with thousands of other pieces of information flowing back to Tokyo. Without context, without understanding how unusual this capability was, the reports didn't receive priority attention. Only when American interrogators questioned Lieutenant Hawkins did Japanese intelligence realize they'd missed something important. The Sherman gyro-stabilizer itself represented American industrial and engineering philosophy. It was a complex mechanism, expensive to produce, requiring precision manufacturing and quality control. The Japanese military had nothing equivalent. Japanese tanks, lighter and less capable than Shermans, focused on simplicity and ease of production with limited industrial resources. The idea of installing a sophisticated gyroscopic mechanism in every tank would have seemed wasteful to Japanese designers. Better to build two simple tanks than one complex one. But American industrial capacity made different calculations. Build the best tank you can, make it reliable, give it every advantage, then build thousands of them. The stabilizer wasn't essential. Sherman tanks could fight without it, but it made them more effective, and American industry could afford to install it in every vehicle produced. That abundance of resources, that ability to engineer sophisticated solutions and then mass-produce them, was what Japanese forces had truly been fighting. Lieutenant Hawkins, whose captured interrogation revealed the stabilizer secret, survived the war and returned to the United States in September 1945 after Japan's surrender. He was unaware that his explanation of the stabilizer had caused consternation in Japanese command. He'd simply answered questions honestly, not realizing his captors didn't already know. In interviews, decades later, Hawkins reflected on his time as a Sherman commander. The stabilizer, he said, was something crews appreciated, but didn't think about much. It was just how the tank worked. You fired while moving, because you could. The idea that enemy forces didn't understand this capability never occurred to him during the war. Japanese anti-tank crews who survived the war and were interviewed by American military historians provided a different perspective. They described the frustration of fighting an enemy who wouldn't behave as expected. Tanks that kept moving, that fired continuously, that seemed to hit targets that should have been impossible shots given the vehicle's motion. Some assumed American crews were simply reckless, accepting inaccuracy for the sake of mobility. Others thought American tanks had superior suspension systems that minimized gun movement. The actual answer, that a gyroscope was actively stabilizing the gun, didn't occur to them because they had no reference point for such technology. The Sherman stabilizers story became a case study in military intelligence failures. It appeared in post-war analyses of Pacific theater operations. It was studied at war colleges as an example of how technological advantages can be decisive if exploited properly and devastating if not recognized. Modern military forces invest heavily in technical intelligence specifically to avoid the kind of blind spot Japanese forces experienced with the Sherman. The broader lesson extended beyond World War II. In warfare, assumptions about enemy capabilities can be as dangerous as lack of capabilities yourself. Japanese anti-tank doctrine assumed enemy tanks would stop to fire accurately. That assumption was reasonable, based on existing technology. But it was wrong, and being wrong meant Japanese tactics were fundamentally flawed against American armor. No amount of courage or determination could compensate for tactics based on false premises. The stabilizer also illustrated how combined arms warfare multiplies technological advantages. The Sherman wasn't invincible. Japanese forces destroyed hundreds of them throughout the Pacific campaign. Well-placed anti-tank guns with good fields of fire could knock out Shermans, but the stabilizer made the Sherman more effective in the close-range, fluid combat that characterized island warfare. Combined with American advantages in infantry training, artillery support, air superiority, and logistics, the stabilizer contributed to an overall superiority the Japanese forces couldn't overcome. By war's end, American industry had produced nearly 50,000 M4 Sherman tanks in various configurations. Each one, built after early 1942, had a gyroscopic stabilizer. Japanese industry, struggling with resource shortages and strategic bombing, produced roughly 6,000 tanks total during the entire war. Most of them light tanks with 37mm or 47mm guns. The disparity in quantity was staggering, but the disparity in quality, in technological sophistication, in design philosophy, was equally significant. The stabilizer cost perhaps a few $100s per tank in manufacturing. In exchange, it gave American crews the ability to fight more effectively, to survive longer, to accomplish their missions with less risk. That return on investment, multiplied across 50,000 tanks, represented exactly the kind of technological and industrial advantage that won the war. Not decisive by itself, but combined with dozens of other advantages. Overwhelming. Japanese generals after the war were asked in interviews and memoirs what they would have done differently if they'd known about the Sherman stabilizer from the beginning. Most answered honestly, nothing. Even knowing about the stabilizer, Japanese forces lacked the industrial capacity to produce equivalent technology. They lacked the resources to fundamentally change their anti-tank doctrine and equipment. Knowing about the stabilizer would have simply clarified why they were losing, not provided a way to win. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines and later in Singapore, put it succinctly in post-war interrogation. He was asked if better intelligence on American technological capabilities would have changed Japanese strategic planning. His answer, "We knew we couldn't match American industry. Learning the specific ways we were outmatched would only have made the knowledge more bitter. We fought with what we had. It was never going to be enough." That resignation, that acknowledgement of fundamental disparity, characterized Japanese military leadership by late in the war. The Sherman stabilizer was one small example of a larger pattern. American technological sophistication, industrial capacity, and logistical capability exceeded Japanese estimates and exceeded Japanese ability to counter. By the time Japanese intelligence identified the stabilizer, the revelation only confirmed what battlefield experience had already taught. American forces had equipment advantages across the board, from the tactical to the strategic level. The legacy of the Sherman stabilizer extended into the Cold War and beyond. The concept of gun stabilization became standard in tank design. Modern main battle tanks have sophisticated stabilization systems that allow accurate fire while moving at high speeds over rough terrain. The principle the Sherman demonstrated, that mobility and firepower don't have to be traded off against each other, became fundamental to armored warfare doctrine. But in 1943, on Tarawa, it was revolutionary, and Japanese forces learned about it the hard way. Today, museum pieces, Sherman tanks, occasionally have their stabilizers demonstrated for visitors. The mechanism, now 8 decades old, represents a moment when American engineering solved a tactical problem in a way that gave frontline troops a real advantage. The tankers who used it probably didn't think of it as revolutionary. It was just how their tank worked. But for Japanese soldiers facing those Shermans, trying to fight them with tactics that assumed tanks couldn't fire accurately while moving, the stabilizer was devastating. The final assessment comes from the numbers. In Pacific Island fighting, American armor losses were significant. Hundreds of Shermans were knocked out or destroyed by Japanese anti-tank weapons, but the loss rate was lower than it might have been, and the effectiveness was higher. The stabilizer contributed to that, not decisively, not single-handedly, but measurably. American tank crews could fight more aggressively, could maintain movement, could engage targets while minimizing their own vulnerability. The cumulative advantage across hundreds of battles, thousands of engagements, helped American forces overcome fortified Japanese positions at terrible but not prohibitive cost. Japanese generals never knew Shermans had gyro-stabilizers until it was too late to matter. By the time they learned, the war was effectively over. But the learning itself carried a bitter lesson. In modern warfare, technological advantages you don't understand can be as dangerous as those you can't counter. Japanese forces spent 3 years fighting the Sherman without fully understanding one of its key capabilities. That failure of intelligence, that gap in understanding, cost lives and contributed to defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The technical specifications of the Westinghouse gyro-stabilizer reveal why Japanese intelligence missed its significance. The device consisted of a gyroscope spinning at approximately 4,000 revolutions per minute, connected through an amplifier system to hydraulic actuators that controlled the gun's elevation. When the tank pitched forward or back while moving over rough terrain, the gyroscope detected the change and signaled the hydraulic system to adjust the gun's angle, keeping it pointed at the original aim point. The entire system operated automatically once the gunner had the target in his sights. It wasn't perfect. Lateral movement, side-to-side rocking, couldn't be compensated for. The stabilizer only worked in the vertical plane. But in practice, this was enough. Most of the gun movement that threw off aim came from the tank's front-to-back pitching as it rolled over obstacles. Compensating for that single axis of movement improved accuracy dramatically. American tankers received specific training on employing the stabilizer. Gunnery schools taught crews to engage targets while moving at speeds between 15 and 25 miles per hour. Slower than that, and you weren't taking full advantage of your mobility. Faster than that, and even the stabilizer couldn't keep up with the violent motion. The sweet spot was right around 20 miles per hour. Fast enough to be a difficult target, slow enough for the stabilizer to function effectively. Training emphasized this. Close with the enemy quickly. Don't present a stationary target. Fire while moving. Trust the stabilizer. Japanese forces, meanwhile, trained their anti-tank crews on captured intelligence that described Sherman armor thickness, engine type, fuel capacity, ammunition storage locations, all useful information, but nothing about the stabilizer because Japanese intelligence hadn't identified it as significant. The reports noted that Shermans seemed to fire while moving, but attributed this to American recklessness or acceptance of inaccuracy. The possibility that American tanks had technology specifically designed for firing on the move didn't occur to Japanese analysts because they had no frame of reference for such capability. This intelligence failure had direct tactical consequences that can be quantified. Japanese after-action reports from Saipan, captured after that island's fall in July 1944, documented anti-tank engagements in detail. Of 47 recorded engagements between Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns and American Sherman tanks, Japanese forces claimed 13 tank kills, but they lost 39 of their 47 guns. The exchange ratio was devastating. For every Sherman destroyed, Japanese forces lost 3 anti-tank guns, and those guns, unlike American tanks, couldn't be replaced. Japan's industrial capacity was already strained. Every anti-tank gun lost was gone permanently. The reports from Saipan noted repeatedly that American tanks fired while advancing, that Japanese gun crews had insufficient time between the enemy's shots to reload and fire again. One report from Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, commanding an anti-tank company, stated explicitly, "The enemy tanks do not halt to aim. They fire continuously while moving. Our doctrine assumes they will stop. This assumption is incorrect and costs us dearly." That report reached Tokyo in August 1944. It was filed with hundreds of other after-action reports from Saipan. No special attention was paid to it. The pattern of American tanks firing while moving had been noted in previous battles. Without understanding the technological reason behind it, Japanese command couldn't develop effective countermeasures. They simply instructed anti-tank crews to fire more quickly, to not wait for perfect shot placement, to engage American armor at longer ranges where the stabilizer's advantage was reduced. These were reasonable adaptations, but they were tactical band-aids on a doctrinal wound. The psychological impact on Japanese anti-tank crews was significant. Soldiers trained for combat with certain expectations about how engagements will unfold. When reality contradicts those expectations repeatedly, it erodes confidence. Japanese anti-tank gunners knew their weapons could destroy Shermans. The 47mm gun could penetrate Sherman's side armor at ranges under 500 yards, but achieving that penetration required hitting the tank, and hitting the tank required it to be stationary or slow-moving. Shermans that kept moving at 20 miles per hour while firing accurately didn't fit the model Japanese crews had trained for. The result was hesitation, uncertainty, and higher casualties. Warrant Officer Kenji Matsuda, captured on Peleliu in September 1944, described this during interrogation. His anti-tank team had engaged 3 Shermans over 2 days of fighting. They'd damaged one track shot that immobilized it, but they'd failed to stop the other 2 and lost their gun to return fire. Matsuda told his interrogators that the American tanks fought like they were invulnerable, moving constantly, firing constantly. He assumed this was American confidence backed by air superiority and overwhelming numbers. He didn't know about the stabilizer. Even in captivity, being told about it, he struggled to understand how such a device could work. The concept was outside his technical framework. This knowledge gap extended to senior Japanese commanders planning defensive operations. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's defensive plan for Iwo Jima, mentioned earlier, assumed that channeling American tanks into kill zones would allow Japanese anti-tank weapons to destroy them efficiently. The plan was sophisticated, well thought out, based on careful study of previous American amphibious assaults, but it assumed American armor would slow down in constricted terrain, would stop to engage Japanese positions, would present opportunities for flanking fire. The stabilizer meant that even in constricted terrain, even while navigating obstacles, Shermans could maintain fire superiority. Kuribayashi's plan wasn't wrong, but it was based on incomplete understanding of enemy capabilities. The irony is that Japanese forces had encountered stabilized gun systems before, just not on tanks. Japanese naval forces knew that American warships used sophisticated fire control systems that could maintain aim even as the ship rolled and pitched. This wasn't news. It was expected. Big ships had the space and weight capacity for complex fire control equipment, but the idea that Americans would miniaturize such technology enough to fit it in a 30-ton tank, then mass-produce it across thousands of vehicles, exceeded Japanese assumptions about what was practical or cost-effective. This was fundamentally a failure of imagination, shaped by Japan's own industrial constraints. Japanese industry couldn't have produced 50,000 gyro-stabilizers. Therefore, American industry probably wouldn't. The logic seemed sound, but it was wrong. By the time Japanese technical intelligence confirmed the stabilizer's existence in April 1945, the Pacific War had less than 4 months left. The knowledge was tactically useless. There was no time to develop countermeasures, no industrial capacity to produce them if they were developed, no strategic situation in which improved anti-tank doctrine would matter. Japan was preparing for invasion of the home islands. The concern wasn't how to fight Sherman tanks more effectively. The concern was that millions of Japanese civilians would die in the fighting to come. The stabilizer revelation was simply one more confirmation of American technological superiority in a war. That superiority had already decided. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese military historians examined why the stabilizer went unrecognized for so long. The consensus pointed to several factors. Japanese technical intelligence was decentralized and under-resourced. Different commands collected their own intelligence with limited sharing. The Navy's technical intelligence didn't communicate effectively with the Army's. Reports from field units went to theater headquarters, but not always to Tokyo. When information did reach Central Command, It competed with immediate operational crises for attention. In an organization fighting losing battles across the Pacific, understanding the technical details of enemy tank fire control systems wasn't the highest priority. There was also institutional resistance to acknowledging enemy technological superiority. Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual strength over material advantage. Admitting that American equipment was substantially more sophisticated than Japanese equipment conflicted with the ideological foundation of the war effort. Reports noting American advantages could be dismissed as defeatism. Officers who emphasized enemy technological superiority risked being seen as lacking fighting spirit. This cultural factor made it difficult for accurate intelligence to be accepted and acted upon, even when it reached decision-makers. The Sherman Gyro-Stabilizer thus became a microcosm of Japan's larger strategic failure. The technology existed. The evidence was observable on every battlefield where Shermans fought. The information reached Japanese intelligence through multiple channels, but the organizational, cultural, and cognitive barriers prevented that information from being properly understood and integrated into doctrine until far too late. By the time Japanese command accepted that American tanks had a technological advantage in fire control, accepting that truth couldn't change the war's outcome, it could only clarify why the outcome had been inevitable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.